Hello everyone, my name is Ned Dimitrov and I'm an assistant professor in the Operations Research Department at the Naval Postgraduate School. And today I'll tell you about an analysis project that we did for U.S. European Command on moving humanitarian assistance cargo. And this is joint work with my student Meredith Dozier, who did this project as her master's thesis at NPS. So to give you some problem background, we were asked to study 3 transportation programs. 2 of these programs are employed by the Department of Defense. That's the Denton program and the Funded Transportation Program. And one of them is employed by the Department of the Navy. That's Project Handclasp. And this picture gives you the problem at a glance. So on the horizontal axis here, we have the 3 programs. And on the vertical axis, we have the approximate shipping of those programs in pounds. The blue bars represent Southcom, that's South America. And the red bars represent Europe. So as you can see, there's significantly less cargo moving to Europe than there is in South America. And the basic goals of today's presentation are 2. The first is to explain why these programs are currently underserving EUCOM. And to do this, we really have to understand a little bit about the current program functionality. In particular, understand some of their legal, fiscal, and operational backing. And number 2 is to explore some options for increasing the shipping to EUCOM. And in particular, we'll point out one particular way forward, but perhaps what's more important than that are the reasons for selecting that way forward over other options. So just to give you some context for today's presentation, first, this presentation and the report that it is based on are derived from detailed discussions with over 20 individuals, most of whom had the opportunity to read a preliminary report and give comments on the report. Those individuals came from over 6 organizations, including the 3 transportation programs themselves. 2 of those individuals were JAGs, just to make sure that everything that we're saying makes legal sense. And a number of the individuals were logistics and analysis specialists. The second piece of context I'd like to point out is that humanitarian assistance really is a core mission of the U.S. Armed Forces as opposed to just peripheral goodwill. And this is evident by reading many strategy documents. Perhaps the clearest example of this is President Obama's strategy that came out just in January this year in 2012, where he listed humanitarian assistance as a primary mission of the U.S. Armed Forces. And this strategy is also reflected operationally by the fact that there's dedicated humanitarian assistance staff and recurring humanitarian assistance missions like Continuing Promise and Pacific Partnership. So let's begin with the content of the presentation by looking each of the 3 programs in turn. The Denton program derives its authority from Title 10, Section 402. And that law is quite specific on a number of points. The first point is that the cargo has to come from a non-governmental source. The second point is that the cargo can only be transported on a space-available basis. And in fact, the law goes further to give a specific checklist of things that have to be met before the cargo can be transported. And the law concludes with a yearly Congressional Reporting requirement that any program that ships under this law has to report those shipments to Congress. Now, even though this is a space-available program, it's not free. It's free to the NGOs that use it, but the Department of Defense pays for it, and that funding is shared between Transcom and the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. So operationally, the Denton program works like this. The process begins when an NGO submits an application to USAID. And this application contains a number of different pieces of information. Perhaps the most importantly, it includes the destination of the cargo and who's going to pick up the cargo on the other end after it actually gets to its destination. After receiving the application, USAID, the Department of State, and DSCA coordinate and check the application. And when I say check the application, what I mean here is that they're really going through all of those checklists that are listed in the law. For example, they're checking that the source is non-governmental, they're checking that the cargo has a humanitarian purpose, they're checking that there's a legitimate recipient on the other end to pick up the cargo, etc. At this point, also, there's a number of fairness measures that are implemented. that make sure that one NGO doesn't monopolize the system. So in particular, only one application for Denton transportation roughly is accepted per NGO at a time. So after the application clears these checks, then Transcom is tasked with identifying a space available route. And in particular, Transcom asks a contractor called JRI to do this. And JRI uses a website that Transcom makes available called the Single Mobility System. Now, the Single Mobility System provides a lot of visibility into upcoming Air Force movement, but essentially no visibility into upcoming Navy movement. And that's why the Denton program really only uses Air Force space available, even though legally it's allowed to use space available on any Department of Defense asset. So if no space available route is identified, then the application is not accepted. But if a space available route is identified, then JRI contacts the NGO and shipping gets executed. So just a two-sentence summary of the Denton program would be something like this. First, the program is driven by NGO applications. And this really is mandated by the law because it specifically states that the cargo has to come from a non-governmental source. And so the program can be viewed really as a public service offered by the Department of Defense to NGOs. And that's really the intent of the original law, to create this nice public service using space available that the Department of Defense is not using. So why does this program underserve UCOM? There's a few reasons for this. The first is that Denton is ultimately driven by these NGO applications. And so if there are few NGO applications to European destinations, no shipping happens. And there are indeed few NGO applications to European destinations for at least a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is that NGOs respond to perceived poverty. And so if you were to ask them, what's the highest levels of poverty around the world that you'd like to concentrate on, they might say South America or Africa or the Pacific, but typically European destinations wouldn't come to the top of their mind. A second reason is that NGOs tend to respond to natural disasters. And at least the natural disasters in Europe haven't permeated the social consciousness in the same way that, let's say, a Haiti-type disaster has permeated. And so you see less NGO response to European destinations in this way. The third reason is that there's actually quite few space available routes to destinations of interest in Europe. And we'll see more about this a little later. So let's move on to the second program, the Funded Transportation Program. Legally, this program derives its authority from Title 10, Section 2561. And that law discusses funds appropriated to the Department of Defense for humanitarian assistance. And in particular, it states that those funds can be used for transporting humanitarian relief. And the law continues to say that there's a yearly congressional reporting requirement for any cargo that's transported in this way. The funding for the Funded Transportation Program comes from the yearly ODACA appropriation, and it's approximately $1.5 million per year. And the actual operation of the Funded Transportation Program is very much modeled after the Denton program. So it begins when an NGO submits an application to DSCA. This application contains essentially the same material as a Denton application. Then DSCA coordinates with the Department of State and checks this application. And these checks are essentially the same checks as a Denton application, that the cargo is coming from a non-governmental source, that it's specifying the various checklists in the Denton law, etc. And then once an application passes this step, DSCA contacts a DoD contractor that executes the delivery. So this is perhaps the key difference between Denton and funded transportation, is that funded transportation doesn't have to do space available route identification because it's just using contracting to deliver the cargo. And so in summary, the Funded Transportation Program can be viewed as an extension of the Denton program to hard-to-reach places. And really, I think that was the intent of the program if you read a lot of documents surrounding it. And so, like the Denton program, it's driven by NGO applications, and it really is a public service offered by the DoD to NGOs. So why does the funded transportation program underserve UCOM? The reasons are quite similar to Denton. First, FTP is driven by NGO applications, and so when there are few NGO applications to European destinations, shipping just can't happen. And the reasons for those few applications are quite similar to Denton, and an additional reason is that there's a Department of State funded program called Counterpart International, or through Counterpart International, that also does shipping to ex-Soviet republics. And so that also takes up some of the demand for these applications. And another point to make here is that both Denton and the Funded Transportation Program are concerned with NGO fairness. So they want to treat all NGO applicants equally. But they're not really expected to have any kind of Cocom fairness because Cocoms aren't the people who they're servicing. So it's not like the Funded Transportation Program is trying to make sure that it's sending as much shipping to Southcom as it is to UCOM, but instead they're just trying to implement NGO fairness. So let's look at the third program, Project Handclasp. Its authority comes from a CNO instruction, and the CNO instruction lays out two missions for Project Handclasp. Its primary mission is to receive, store, and process goodwill material. And this material is to be used for direct distribution by Navy personnel to people in need overseas. And its secondary mission is an organization-to-organization transport, much like the Denton program. And its funding just comes from the Navy. Operationally, Project Handclasp consists of two legal entities. The first is the Navy Project Handclasp, which is a Navy program that's staffed by Navy personnel. And the second entity is the Project Handclasp Foundation. The Project Handclasp Foundation is a NGO. It's a nonprofit that's typically staffed by retired Navy personnel, but all of its personnel are non-military personnel. The way the Project Handclasp process works is that an NGO donor provides the material. And when this material is provided, what happens is that legal ownership or title of the material goes to the Project Handclasp Foundation, while the material itself goes to Navy Project Handclasp. And there's a MOU between these two organizations that governs their relationship. This material can be provided in one of two ways, and these two ways correspond to the two missions of Project Handclasp. So the first way is consigned material, where the NGO specifies a particular destination and recipient. And the second way is unconsigned material, where the NGO is just saying, this is goodwill material and can be used at the commander discretion. It can go wherever commanders need it to go. The Project Handclasp process continues as follows. A Navy component commander would request some material from the Navy Project Handclasp, and in addition would provide some upcoming ship schedules. Then the Navy Project Handclasp would look through the materials that are available to see if there's any materials that can satisfy these requests. And if those materials are available, it'll use the ship schedules to plan out and execute the shipments. So this is a key difference between Project Handclasp and Denton, is that Project Handclasp directly gets ship schedules from Navy component commanders, and that's why it's able to use Navy space available shipping, whereas Denton is not. And currently Project Handclasp, since it's a Navy program, is really limited to only using Navy space available shipping. So in summary, Project Handclasp is a Navy program, it's funded by the Navy, and it's driven by Navy mission requirements. And this is in contrast with Denton and FTP that are really driven by the NGO applications as opposed to mission requirements. So why does Project Handclasp underserve UCOM? Well, the number one reason is that Project Handclasp can only use Navy space available assets because it's a Navy-run program. And so there are no frequent Navy channels to UCOM's destination of interest. And that's why Project Handclasp, even if it has the cargo, currently cannot actually send the cargo to where UCOM would like it to go. Another reason is that there's no equivalent of Pacific Partnership or Continuing Promise that are going on in EUCOM. So just to give you an example of why this is important, if you remember that big blue bar for Project Handclasp and Southcom earlier, 50% of those shipments actually came out of the Continuing Promise mission. So really these missions make up a large amount of Project Handclasp's shipments to other areas of responsibility. And this brings us to our first conclusion, which is that currently no program focuses on Cocom HA cargo transportation priorities. And that's because the Denton and the Funded Transportation Program are driven by NGO applications, while Project Handclasp is a Navy program that's focusing on Navy mission. So let's continue to look at perhaps quantifying some options for increasing the shipping to EUCOM. So to do this, we created an analytical transportation model, and the details of this model are not important. I just want to let you know that we did our homework by giving you some numbers. So this model consists of 124 transportation nodes. So these are Air Force bases and ports around EUCOM and the United States. And the data that was used to feed the model were 50,000 historical flight legs that we got from Transcom's single mobility system, 1,600 port visits, historical port visits that happened in EUCOM that we got from 6th Fleet, about 2,500 flight legs that we got from Navy Air Logistics Office that are happening around EUCOM historically, and about 750 contract cost estimates from Surface Deployment Distribution Command. So we use that data to create a transportation model that can conceptually be divided into 4 different kinds of transportation. So the first is Air Force space available. This is essentially the transportation that's available to Denton. The second is Navy space available, and this is essentially the transportation that's available to Project Handclasp. The third is contracting, basically what's available to Funded Transportation Program. And the third is a combined operation that combines space available and contracting. So let's look at some of the results for this analytical model. So in this graph, we're showing the wait times to ship a single Air Force pallet to a EUCOM destination of interest using Air Force space available. So on the horizontal axis here are the different destinations of interest, and on the vertical axis is the expected wait time before shipment in weeks. So for example, to ship to Romania, you might wait about 5 weeks, while to ship to Georgia, you might wait about 33 weeks before you can ship. So the main takeaway I want you to take from this graph is that only 5 of the 17 destinations of interest have wait times of less than 1 year, and those would be Georgia and the ones to the right. And just by looking at those destinations, you can see intuitively some of that is due to operations in Afghanistan. And so as those operations are winding down, you'll see these wait times increase because there'll be less movement to Afghanistan that space available could piggyback on. The other point I want to make here is that this graph is derived from assuming 100% utilization of space available routes. So what I mean by this is that there's a computer program that's just looking for paths that it could send the cargo on, and it might identify some path that has maybe 6 flight legs to it. But a human being would never put the cargo on such a route because they would be worried that the cargo would get bumped off in the middle, and then what do you do? How do you get it back onto some other route, etc.? And so in reality, we're getting less than 100% utilization. So just to show you what that would look like, here's the same graph using only 80% utilization. And so now you can see there's only 2 countries with wait times less than a year. That's Georgia and Romania. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that this graph looks bad, which is only 5 countries wait time less than a year. But in reality, you're actually doing even worse than that. So here's a similar graph for Navy space available, and the picture is very similar, that again only 5 of 17 destinations have wait times of less than 1 year. So those would be Georgia and to the right here. And this graph again is derived using 100% utilization, but in reality you're getting worse than this because that's not happening on the Navy side either. So if space available doesn't do the job, let's look at the other two methods of transportation, which is contracting and combined operations. So in this graph on the horizontal axis, we have the 17 countries of interest. And on the vertical axis, we have the cost per shipping an Air Force pallet to that destination. So the main takeaways I want you to take from here is that the costs range between $3,800 and $2,400 per pallet, and that combined operation reduces costs by about 24% on average. So at least I interpret this to mean that there isn't a drastic cost reduction by combining contracting and space available, that they're really competitive with each other. And so that brings us to the second conclusion, which is that exclusively space available transportation is just not sufficient to reach the destinations of interest in EUCOM, and that contracted delivery is likely required. So now let's look at some administrative options for increasing shipping to EUCOM. We identified 6 such options. They are number 1, do nothing. Number 2, realign Denton or the Funded Transportation Program to focus on Cocom mission. Number 3, give a joint role to Project Handclasp. Number 4, create some kind of common execution of shipments between Denton, FTP, and Project Handclasp. Number 5, create a new program as a lead executor. Or number 6, create multiple programs, perhaps one for each service or for each Cocom. So let's discuss each of these in turn to see some of their pros and cons. So for do nothing, basically what's going on right now is that there's no quality of service guarantee to Cocoms. Essentially, Cocoms could encourage NGO applications to Denton or FTP, or Cocoms may ask for assistance for tasking Project Handclasp through a Navy component commander, but that's the only 2 options for actually getting cargo through here. And neither of these options actually guarantee a quality of service to the Cocom mission. The second option would be to realign Denton and FTP to focus on Cocom mission. This is generally a bad idea because these are well utilized and liked Department of Defense programs. Just because they don't focus on Cocom mission doesn't mean that they're bad programs. In particular, having a Cocom come in and elbow out the NGOs who like these programs would have negative impacts on their relationships with these NGO partners. And it would ultimately remove the beneficial impact of these existing programs. And in fact, it's not legal to do this for Denton, because Denton specifically says non-governmental source. Option number 3 would be to give a joint role to Project Handclasp. So the upsides here is that this builds on Project Handclasp's relationships and experience in dealing with NGOs. Since Project Handclasp would be now executing a joint mission for a Cocom, it expands Project Handclasp's capabilities to use non-Navy assets. In particular, Project Handclasp could use contracting to deliver its cargo. But the downsides are that this really requires Cocom funding to execute, and that's because the Navy doesn't like to resource Cocom mission, and so if Project Handclasp is doing Cocom mission, then there should be some funding associated with that. And the second part is that this really requires some adjustment of Project Handclasp operations, and we'll talk about that some more shortly. Option number 4 is to create some kind of common execution between Denton, the Funded Transportation Program, and Project Handclasp. Now the basic idea here is to use the Project Handclasp Foundation as an NGO to submit applications to Denton and FTP. But this is a bad idea because ultimately it misapplies Denton and FTP to satisfy Cocom mission. And in particular, it's already been attempted, and there was little success in doing so. But even if there were very good success with this and the process worked very smoothly, ultimately the Project Handclasp Foundation would be treated as any other NGO, and so NGO fairness rules would kick in, and Cocoms would ultimately get no quality of service for their mission. So this route provides no quality of service guarantee. Option number 5 would be to create a new program as a lead executor for this Cocom mission. And the downside of this is that this really doesn't make use of the existing capabilities in current HA programs. So this may not be a good idea. Number 6 is to create multiple programs, perhaps one for each service or for each Cocom. But what would happen here is that really this would lead to a lot of confusion on the part of NGOs willing to assist. Should the NGO deal with the Navy's program, UCOM's program, the Army's program? It would get quite confusing. And additionally, it would severely complicate these congressional reporting requirements because now there would be many, many agencies that would be involved in doing this kind of transportation. And so collating that information into a report might be quite difficult. So based on this reasoning, we recommend a joint role for Project Handclasp. And we'll discuss that option in detail in just a second. But if I were listening to this presentation, a natural question I would have is, okay, if that falls through, what would be a second best option? A second best option would be to create a new program. But really, this is a significantly worse option. And that's because it would create confusion between Project Handclasp and this new program. Which one's actually executing mission transportation? It would be unclear. And so we're definitely not recommending the second best option. But if you need one, there it is. So let's look at this recommended option of giving Project Handclasp a joint role. So legally and fiscally, this could work as follows. First, the authority of that could come from Title 10, Section 2561. Now, this is the exact same law under which the Funded Transportation Program works. And in particular, I want you to remember that this law has a yearly congressional reporting requirement for any shipments funded under the law. The funding could come from the ODACA appropriation, which are funds given to the Department of Defense for doing humanitarian assistance. And in particular, a Cocom could use its ODACA dollars to figure out what shipments it would like to execute in its particular area of responsibility. So some issues here is that currently Cocom HA staff are not allowed to use their ODACA dollars for transport. And there's a very good reason for this. The reason is basically because of that congressional reporting requirement. If there's many, many different organizations executing these transportations, then it's very difficult to organize the information to actually report to Congress. But ultimately, this is an organizational issue and not a legal one. And so if there's a lead executor that's executing all of these shipments, that executor could provide clear records of all the shipments that happened and could work along with the Funded Transportation Program for creating the congressional report. So as long as there's a single clearinghouse lead executor, this congressional reporting requirement should be relatively straightforward to satisfy. Operationally, this possibility could look something like this. Basically, Project Handclasp in its joint role could get direct tasking by the Cocom HA staff. In particular, working with U.S. aid and the country teams, the Cocom HA staff could submit a priority list that they've assembled for their area of responsibility to Project Handclasp. Project Handclasp takes a look at this priority list of materials and tries to identify any material in its warehouses that could go to satisfy these priorities. After identifying and perhaps repackaging this material, it lets the Cocom know that this material is available, at which point the Cocom can approve and fund the transportation, and then Project Handclasp can execute the transportation, for example, using contracting or space available or whatever means. So let's discuss some possible benefits and some areas of further consideration for taking a look at this possibility. So some possible benefits are the following. First, Cocoms have dedicated HA staff, whereas currently in Navy component commanders, this is often a collateral duty. And because Cocoms have this dedicated HA staff, that staff could provide a lot better oversight in exactly what material is getting shipped to that area of responsibility. in particular because now Project Handclasp would be funded to execute Cocom mission. Cocoms could expect the quality of service from Project Handclasp, and they would be able to get that quality of service because Project Handclasp would be able to now access non-Navy assets for this kind of Cocom mission cargo. The other couple of points here come from various grievances that you would hear from different Cocom HA staff about Project Handclasp operations in the past. So one of the grievances comes from this concept of push versus pull transportation. So sometimes what happens is a Project Handclasp shipment would show up in a country and the Cocom HA staff wouldn't know about that shipment. And then when there's some kind of perhaps not nice publicity that comes out of that shipment, the Cocom HA staff has to deal with it even though they didn't order the shipment. Now what is actually going on is that that shipment was requested by a Navy commander somewhere down the line, and what broke down is the communication by the NCC to the Cocom HA staff. But if there's direct tasking by the Cocom HA staff to Project Handclasp, Project Handclasp could provide transparency into all of the shipments that are going into that particular AOR to the Cocom HA staff, who would now be dealing directly with Project Handclasp. And so this would allow for essentially the transportation to that particular AOR to be double checked by the Cocom HA staff, and to only be this kind of pull transportation where cargo is only getting sent if there's a clear request from that transportation or for that cargo. The second grievance that you might hear is that sometimes when space available gets used, because it's essentially zero cost, some very low value cargo could make it across. And if you have this low value cargo make it across, it doesn't really make for a very good partnership building or for a very good photo opportunity if that's what people are looking for. And so if these shipments are actually getting contracted, that would make sure that the cargo that goes on them has a certain level of value. So in particular, if you're paying $10,000 to ship a 20-foot container, hopefully that container would contain more than $20,000 worth of, or more than $10,000 worth of supply. The final possible benefit here is that once Project Handclasp is executing Cocom mission, then Cocoms could evaluate Project Handclasp not based on the number of pounds shipped to their AOR, but based on other metrics, like for example, how well does Project Handclasp execute Cocom mission requirements? So some areas of further consideration here, if this possibility were taken up, would be the following. First is that Project Handclasp is a well-liked and utilized Navy program. And so likely as you talk to folks in the Navy, there would be some concern about the Navy being able to continue to utilize Project Handclasp because Project Handclasp has been doing an excellent job for them in the past. And there would be some concern about maybe the program getting too big, etc. A second area of concern here is that for this to work, Project Handclasp really has to provide transparency into the kinds of shipments that are going on. And this is for congressional reporting as mandated by the laws under consideration or that are concerned here. In the past, Project Handclasp hasn't been doing this, and that's because it's been working under the CNO instruction that doesn't mandate a congressional report. But really, it's not a big deal to provide transparency and to provide clear records of what the shipments are and execute these congressional reports. The third area of consideration here is that really to get something like this done, it really requires high-level involvement. And that's because to get this done, it requires coordination between multiple organizations. It requires coordination between a Cocom, the Navy, DSCA, folks in the Department of Defense that give guidance to Cocom HA staff so that the word can be spread, etc. And so I'm putting this in red because this is really targeted towards high-level personnel listening to this presentation. To get this done, this requires high-level involvement. Without your involvement, what's going to happen is the do-nothing option. So if I've lost you somewhere in the talk, really the only thing that you need to remember is this slide. Number one, currently no program focuses on Cocom HA cargo transportation requirements. Number two, the legal, fiscal, and operational mechanisms exist to create such a program. And number three, exclusively space-available transportation is likely not sufficient to get the transportation done in a timely manner. Thank you very much for listening.